CBS News. Countdown continues at the Kennedy Space Center as the 3 American astronauts prepare for their liftoff scheduled 50 minutes from now. I'm Douglas Edwards reporting on the CBS radio network. All systems are go as Reed Collins reports from the Kennedy Space Center.
The American team of astronauts has swiftly completed a series of checks inside the spacecraft, and they've gotten about 45 minutes ahead of schedule. A bright sun is sending a sliver of light through the hatch window. This has brought a murmur of complaint from the occupants inside, but the sun really is welcome. Launch manager Paul Donnelly has radioed Thomas Stafford. There may be some cloud banks along the ground track, but conditions are fine in the immediate launch area. The crew of Soyuz 19, meanwhile, has been trying to fix a camera inside their craft that was supposed to show them during the Soyuz ascent. It apparently is not working. Soyuz has performed a slight orbital correction, and that did work well. The Apollo launch is heading toward planned liftoff at 10 minutes to the next hour, and all is well here. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Secretary of State Kissinger praised the joint space mission today as a symbol of progress in U.S.-Soviet relations. In a speech to the Upper Midwest Council of Minneapolis, Kissinger defended détente as a way of controlling a competitive relationship, and he challenged critics of the policy to come up with a better alternative. More news after this message.
Soyuz, a meeting in space. I'm Reed Collins, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Headquarters in Florida. Well, the American half of this mission is about to begin. The astronauts Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Donald Slayton are in the Apollo spacecraft out there on Pad B. It stands on a Saturn 1B rocket, which in turn is standing on a spider-like launch pedestal bathed in sun. The access arm that leads from the launch stand over which they walk is now swung completely away. We are less than 5 minutes from liftoff of this, the last American chapter of manned flight, the first joint mission with the other major power. The launch director, Walter Kaplan, will tell you that now that Soyuz 19 is safely up there, the pressure is enormous to get the Americans off.
The pressure is quite great. As a matter of fact, the pressure on me is more from on top, from my management, than it is from the actual operation itself. We have learned quite a bit in the last year to year and a half with respect to electrical fields aloft and with respect to levels at which lightning gets triggered and with respect to levels at which you can trigger lightning and still not hurt the vehicle.
But Walter Kaplan need not worry about lightning, at least not for the present, because there's a big arena of blue up above the launch pad. No real weather threat here except far out at sea. Some high cumulus clouds are building up, but they're far to the east. Astronauts who have been inside for more than 2 hours cannot see for the protective boost cover over the command ship, though. The commander of this flight, Thomas Stafford, the space veteran, now an Air Force general, 44 years old, is over in the left-hand couch. Stafford's able to put aside the ideological differences in this.
As far as the pure politics between the systems of government, we have made a special effort that we keep that out of this mission. As far as the implications, it's really a visible demonstration to the world that you can work together on an effort if you put good faith into it and live up to the agreements.
We're 3 minutes away now in the center couch. Vance Brand, 44-year-old former Marine fighter pilot. Brand has learned the Russian language better than his companions, and he sees this mission as a wedge into the future.
I think that it's important that we make this first step in cooperation. We don't all know what it will lead to, but there are a lot of fruitful areas that could be open to us.
And over in the right-hand couch lies Donald Slayton, known to everybody as Deke, an original Mercury astronaut grounded by a heart murmur for years. Slayton finally has won his clearance for flight, and he's grabbed the last one. At 51, he's going to be the oldest man to enter space. Slayton likes the Russian people, but he is outspoken about the system.
I think they've got a lousy system of government. I don't want any part of it, but I think their people are friendly and very compatible to work with, and we've got good working relationships.
And so these men are about to pioneer the attempt at high-altitude détente, a mission that has cost this country some $250 million and will close out America's manned presence in space until the space shuttle of the 1980s. The rocket itself, the ninth 1B Saturn model ever to fly, it's 224 feet tall, standing out there, coxing away and waiting for its moment. It's an old-timer. It was built in 1967. Let's join now as we come up to 1 minute and 35 seconds. The voice of Mission Control here, Chuck Hollingshead.
Deke Slayton will flip
Minus
two
130.
switches in the spacecraft to bring the spacecraft batteries online. These batteries will give added electrical power and also are a backup to the fuel cells. At the 1 minute mark, the water will start pouring onto the flame deflector underneath the pad, and at 30 seconds we'll get water on the mobile launcher deck itself. Deke now has brought those batteries online. T-minus 1 minute, 6 seconds. The last action performed by the crew will be a T-minus 45 seconds, and at that time, Tom Stafford will make a final guidance alignment. T-minus 55 seconds. We'll be getting switched to internal power shortly. All of the tanks now pressurized, and we're switching to internal power. Stafford reports he has made the final GDC align. First stage, second stage, and instrument unit now on internal power. Approaching the 30-second mark in our countdown, water pouring onto the flame deflector, now coming onto the deck of the mobile launcher. Everything proceeding smoothly. We'll get a guidance release at the 17-second mark.
20 seconds.
The engines will actually start. Engine sequence starts at 3.1 seconds in the countdown.
Thousands of people now have gathered around the full face and all eyes.
Ready, light,
Literally
on.
thousands
Nine,
of riveted.
8,
7, 6, 5, 4. We should have ignition very soon. We have it. We have it. And I believe we have a commit, and we're moving. Lift off. We're clear of the tower. Clear of the tower. She's on her way. We're listening now to hear perhaps the reporting voice of Tom Stafford. Clear blue up above, just a faint sketch of cloud behind it. That full sapphire flame with the 8 engines of the Saturn 1B pushing her up, cleaving the air above. It's a beautiful sight into a bright, bright sun, into the roll program now and out of it, looking for the correct azimuth to catch Soyuz, which now is about 1,000 miles east of Newfoundland. The keying, we're listening to see if we can hear some word from the rising astronauts, the last Americans.
Apollo now 3 miles in altitude, 1 mile downrange. Stand by for mode 1 Bravo. Mark, 1 Bravo. 1 Bravo, search. Roger. Cabin pressure coming down. Roger. Cabin pressure relieving as expected, coming up on the region of maximum dynamic pressure.
The big jolting up there as she begins to form a contrail.
Through max Q, everything's still looking good. And your feet wet, on your way. Roger, feet wet.
Feet wet means if they had to come back, they'd come back in water. The contrail is formed, and now it's left as they've gone through a thin, high cloud cover. We still see the flame.
It's still looking good, 6 miles downrange. Roger. We'll be right back. SMRCS A flight. Roger. Apollo Houston, you're mode 1 Charlie. Yeah, Roger, 1 Charlie, Dick. That's fine. And Pete Frank getting a status for staging. Go for staging. Houston, you're go for staging.
Go for staging, we'll be able to see it with the naked eye.
And we have a report that we are losing some data here in the control center. Lost data from the command module computer. Trajectory still looking good.
There's the towards the shutdown.
Roger. We got accelerate. Roger. Apollo Houston, we've had a PU shift and thrust is up on S4B, looking real fine, right on the money. Roger, Dick.
It's Dick Truly in Houston, talking to Tom
Dick
Stafford.
Truly advising the crew that everything looks good on the side of the second stage.
All right, Jeff, there she goes.
Roger, Tower Jetson, your mode. And the launch tower no longer needed, has been jettisoned as planned. Okay, it's got rudder 4.
Guidance is initiated.
Roger, confirm. 50 miles in altitude now, 80 miles downrange.
The voice of Mission Control in Houston, Texas, telling us where we're going and how fast and how far.
Guidance looks very good at this point. The command module computer data is intermittent now, and everything looks good.
People beginning to drift away. people actually leaving the site here as though they've decided the show is over. Although, of course, for those 3 men, it just begins.
3:30 onward to Roger, Tom, concur. Okay.
Right, they're climbing up and out, and we are now completing the second half of the mission that began really 7.5 hours ago, way over east of Moscow at Baikonur, a mysterious place, which we're learning a little bit more about time. My correspondent, Rich Roscoe, our CBS News Space Headquarters there. I'd like how it seemed here to there.
It seems very dramatic, Reed, and the flight control side at Kaliningrad, just a few miles away from us in Moscow, we're watching very intently a large screen that showed the liftoff of the Apollo satellite. They were looking at any cigars. I don't know if they've got here.
I'd like to send the cigars that far.
Perhaps I'd like to tell you a little bit about Soyuz 19 that the up there and meet. It's being described here as a nominal mission, and as far as the Soviet press is concerned, there is nothing at all happening at all problems that we've heard about. Apparently nothing of major concern at this time. The first was with a television camera aboard the launch and descent vehicle that the cosmonauts rode into space in. And that camera was supposed to have shown pictures during the launch. A while later, Soyuz took their module, the upper mission Soyuz, with the area of American space. And another multiple system. They would be given time later, in a few hours probably, to try to isolate the cause of that camera failure. The only other thing that we've heard that seems a potential problem, or seems to be some kind of a minor difficulty, is that Leonov has complained about noise in his voice communication system. That complaint came about 2 or 3 hours ago, and we haven't heard it repeated.
Well, Richard, I suppose we have to get used to the fact that not everything works exactly as planned. I know that the Americans have been leery about putting an ascent camera in an ascending spacecraft for fear of an abort that might jerk the thing loose and have it floating around in there doing damage. But I think this was a Soviet idea, the ascent camera, and it's a pity that from the Soyuz point of view it did not work. We should mention maybe that there are plenty more cameras available, there are nearly half a dozen of them, and they'll come into use particularly Thursday when the real rendezvous and docking and the apex of this mission really begins to come off.
That's right, Reed. The only thing that we're wondering about here, and we haven't been able to get a confirmation on, is if it is a system problem. There is that fourth camera that's mounted outside that the cosmonauts, it really provides the cosmonauts the only view of the approaching Apollo during docking procedures. It's not a problem, really, and that Apollo is the active partner, but Soyuz won't be able to see much if that camera doesn't work.
Well, they have a periscope, I believe, don't they, Richard? Maybe that will do just as well instead. But at any rate, I think we have to count everything a signal success when you get 2 successive spacecrafts launched in the correct orbit, and our men are approaching orbital speed and distance right now. That's a big plus, is it not?
I think that there is no argument with that, and I think it's being regarded in much the same way here. A Soviet friend of mine came by just after the launch of the Soyuz, and I congratulated him, and he offered his congratulations to me, and then he paused and said, well, maybe I'm too early. And then he thought better of it, and he said, well, I'm sure I can offer them to you in advance.
I think that's been the general theme of things here. I've never seen quite this many people in the press viewing area. I guess they become more apparent because now they've all moved out of the bleachers and they're wandering around and are probably trying to figure out how they're going to face what bids to be one of the biggest traffic jams coming out of the Cape area in some years. But whoever was here and whoever was there and whoever listened heard the closing of an era, Richard, as far as American spaceflight is concerned. But the Soviets, whom you were covering, seem as enthusiastic about manned flight as ever, don't they?
They do. There was a Izvestia this evening, the government newspaper. It's a 4-page newspaper, and just about 2 full pages were filled with coverage of the space mission under the headline in red, Soyuz Apollo Orbital Cooperation. And there were front-page pictures of the cosmonauts suited up as well as the astronauts suited up. And on the back page, the words and music of a new song here called Rendezvous with the Cosmonauts. Any songs like that there?
No, Richard. In fact, you can't orchestrate in a Western society the sort of thing that TASS and the government news monopoly can orchestrate there. I must say that there was a contrast that was deeply evident to me. Back in 1962, on a marquee in front of a motel down the strip at Cocoa Beach, there appeared the phrase, "The hopes and prayers of the free world go with you, John Glenn." That, of course, in reference to the upcoming Glenn first orbital flight. Today, as I got up in the middle of the night and passed that same marquee in front of that same motel, it read, "Cocktail hour, 5 to 7:30. So I think that speaks a little bit of the attitude which we have adopted toward what has become a fairly common occurrence in this country.
Maybe that's détente, too.
Maybe that's détente. It could be occasioned by a number of economic factors that perhaps Mr. Marx and Mr. Lennon could have told us more about. I'm not sure.
There's someone we haven't seen before among flight controllers now at Kaliningrad near Moscow, and that is a woman in a bright red dress. One of the interesting things about the Soviet cosmonauts is that whenever we've asked them about why there hasn't been a second woman in space, they said, well, the work is too hard, or when the men get tired, that'll be the time for the women. And we didn't know there were any women flight directors, but we see one now.
Well, we, of course, in a chauvinistic way, have counted up women, and we've done some features, I think, on the number of women engineers employed by NASA and those in the launch control centers, and we have a share of them. There are an increasing number of them. And I suppose perhaps we just don't take note of the fact anymore, but this is a thing that has evolved over the years rather quietly. While we're speaking, Richard, we're still getting more information. Perhaps we should get back to our astronauts and see how they're coming. Everything has been so smooth, so nominal, as they say, that we haven't really been concerned at all once they left sight.
Apollo Houston, in about 30 seconds, we're going to have LOS from Bermuda, so we'll lose S-band, but we'll keep you on VHF at Newfoundland.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, and Houston, could you double check band D? I'm not sure it's untied. I'm still showing some average.
I'm sorry, Dick, you're going to have to say again, please.
Yeah, band bus D. I came off the band bus tie. I'm still showing some average. Can you guys confirm that it's in fact off?
Dick Slayton troubleshooting some battery indications. Over there on the right-hand couch, docking module pilot.
Roger, Dick, you're okay. That's average from the EDS, and when down at the bottom of the list, when you get the fuel cell reactance valve to normal, that'll go away. No problem.
Very soon we should have the confirmation, and I think we're just about to get orbit confirmed. We don't know exactly what the parameters of it are, but it must be very, very close to what they want. The Soyuz, Richard, if you're still with us, the Soyuz performed a small corrective orbital maneuver, I believe, a couple of hours back, didn't it?
It was about 3 hours after, a little more than 3 hours after it blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. However, as has been the case here, perhaps an oversight, we have not been able to receive any details on that orbital maneuver. Soyuz was supposed to report to Americans on the status of that short burn, and we haven't heard anything back here from the NASA people on what happened. Maybe you have.
I believe that they're pleased with the results there, and that they have pretty well confirmed in Houston that it did what it was supposed to do and did it on time. But the interpretation requirements and the immediate in-time translation, I believe, has been handled reasonably well. I don't know how the English into Russian translation is going over there, but I believe the Russian to English has gone swiftly, accurately, and concisely here.
It's been impressive here, Reed. The only thing that I can think of that happened that caused some initial confusion was a reference during the launch sequence to what was called a flight overload, indicating that the cosmonauts were experiencing more G-forces during acceleration than they had anticipated. And it turned out that overload was the English translation of the Russian phrase indicating G-forces. It was not an overload, it was slight G-forces that they were actually experiencing. I imagine a thing like that will crop up every once in a while during the next few days.
I believe it will. There are some people who are very proficient in both languages who still have to take some special remedial lessons in the technology area because most Americans don't perhaps know all the English for that. And then your Soviet compatriots also have some acronyms that they've invented for their things, haven't they?
They do indeed. Reed, I'm wondering what the Soviet flight observers are doing in the United States, a distance from where you are. But here in Kaliningrad, they're smiling. They're wearing their red, white, and blue in considerable contrast to the Soviet flight controllers. We're all dressed in suits and ties. The Americans are in very snappy red, white, and blue caps and white knit shirts with stripes and emblems and badges all over them. And they're watching from a second room, a separate room in the Kaliningrad center.
Richard, let me interrupt and let's hear the voice of Anatoly Dobrynin, who is speaking here in our Launch Control Center.
Wake up, second, and I could tell that now Russian cosmonauts are preparing already warming up their dinner for your astronauts. Well done, and thank you very much. The best wishes to all of you, and of course to both of our teams which are there up in the cosmos. Thank you very much.
And Anatoly Dobrynin has set a sort of whole space first of himself, the first Soviet official to accept an invitation, although we have extended many in times past, to come and witness an Apollo launch. And he was the guest of the president earlier in the day. We are running out of time. The astronauts are really eating up the ground. They're in orbit. They are safe. The next signal event is to take place, of course, Thursday when they rendezvous dock together in Apollo-Soyuz. Continuing coverage of Apollo-Soyuz, this is Reed Collins, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
KTRH News.
Johnson Space Center and the Apollo astronauts are just now preparing for their next maneuver in the Apollo-Soyuz test project mission, and that is the capture of the docking module, which is stored in the S-4B stage. As many people will probably remember, the lunar module was stored in a very similar fashion in the S-4B stage. It calls for a turnaround of the Apollo command module. This will begin taking place shortly after 4 o'clock. The spacecraft will separate from the S-4B stage. It will circle around, come in from behind, nose into the S-4B stage, and pull out the docking module. Extremely critical maneuver, needless to say. If you don't capture the docking module, there can be no docking. Meanwhile, all continues to go well with Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand. A quick report on the Russians to Harry Walsh. How does it look for the Soyuz crew?
Well, they're asleep, David, and they've gone into a period. According to their time, it's something like midnight now, and so they are scheduled for something like 7 to 9 hours of sleep.
Sounds like a capital idea.
I think so.
This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
PM.
CBS News. And now there are two, one American, one Russian spacecraft orbiting the Earth headed for a historic rendezvous. I'm Douglas Edwards reporting on the CBS radio network. 1 hour and 10 minutes ago, precisely on schedule, the American Apollo rocket carrying 3 U.S. astronauts roared off Cape Canaveral in Florida. Reed Collins has the latest.
Coming around on their first revolution, the Apollo men were told, there appears to be a bubble in the system that pressurizes one of their control systems. But niet problem, as the Soviets would say. One of the major events next is pulsing the spacecraft out and away from the final stage and turning around to extract the docking module, the 10-foot pressure lock through which the cosmonauts and astronauts will pass in visiting each other's spaceships on Thursday. The docking module is essential to the success of this mission, containing the compatible docking petals that match those on the nose of the orbiting Soyuz. As the Apollo mission enters its second hour, all goes well on this detente highway 100 miles up. Reed Collins, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center.
Speaking in Minneapolis this afternoon, Secretary of State Kissinger praised the joint space mission as a symbol of progress in American-Soviet relations.
In our relations with the Soviet Union. The United States will maintain its strength, defend its interests, and support its friends with determination and without illusion. We will speak up for our beliefs with vigor and without self-deception. We consider détente a means to regulate a competitive relationship, not a substitute for our own efforts in building the strength of the free world.
Secretary Kissinger then challenged detractors to come up with a better alternative. A new snag in the Middle East in a moment.
Testimony postponed. Astronauts are en route to an orbital docking with the Russian cosmonauts. With an update, here's KTRH reporter David Crane with Terry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
Reports that a hydrogen bubble had formed in the RCS reaction control system aboard the Apollo command module. These are the steering jets, if you please, on the command module. May be somewhat too premature. First of all, it is not apparently a serious problem. Talking with one of the representatives of Rockwell, the builders of the Apollo command module, he assures me that indeed there is a hydrogen bubble in the RCS or with the steering jets that is the simple matter that it can be purged from the system. Also, they are not positive that indeed there is a hydrogen bubble in that system. They are still checking their data on that. Meantime, they are still looking to go ahead and do as a matter of fact, that process is getting underway right now, to extract the docking module from the S4B stage and then continue on its way in its flight to catch Soyuz. Harry Walsh, what do we hear from the Russian cosmonauts?
They're asleep, David, and they will be asleep for another 8 hours. So their activity is ended for what for them is the night. It's approximately 12 midnight to 1 p.m., 1 a.m. in the morning in their time.
Okay, and if we get any further updates on that hydrogen bubble, if indeed there is one, we'll be sure to pass it along immediately. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center. Approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes after launch, the Apollo astronauts have performed successfully another measure in their mission to rendezvous and dock with the Soyuz spacecraft. Just moments ago over Rosman, North Carolina, about 95 miles above Rosman, North Carolina. Tom Stafford flew the command module around the S4B stage and extracted the docking module.
Roger, got a good hard dock with it real lined up and all the latches are good. Okay, super, Tom.
And that's Dick Truly, Capcom, saying super, Tom Stafford, good docking. Next step now, they maneuver away from the S4B stage and began a series of corrective maneuvers that by Thursday, shortly before noon, will put them into a proper alignment to rendezvous and dock with the Soyuz spacecraft. Harry, any activity on the Russian side yet?
Well, David, I prematurely put them to bed twice, but now unless they're hopelessly insomniac, I should think they're in their period of sleep by now.
All right, very good. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
Well, here we
A light day tomorrow, but the chase will go on. I'm David Crane with Harry Walsh, the Johnson Space Center. We'll be back with details in just a moment. It all started with a successful launch of the Soyuz spacecraft from the Turytom launch site this morning in Central Asia. It continued with a successful launch of the Apollo spacecraft at 2:50 this afternoon from the Cape. And we've just completed another phase of the mission just a few moments ago, as the Apollo crew have repositioned the spacecraft, got into the tail of the S4B stage and extracted the docking module, the module that will unite the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft shortly before noon Thursday. In the meantime, it's been a busy day today. Tomorrow is relatively light, but several critical maneuvers are being planned for the Apollo. 2 circularization burns or corrective phasing maneuvers are scheduled yet later this afternoon and early this evening. The Apollo spacecraft right now is in an elliptical orbit of about 92.4 by 83.1. By tomorrow it will be at about 120. rate 140. And Harry Walsh, I believe the Russians have a couple of circularization burns yet scheduled.
They have one, David. They have a very important one that's scheduled to take place tomorrow at 7:46 in the morning, Houston time. At the present time, the Soyuz is circling the Earth with an apogee of approximately 231 kilometers and a perigee of approximately 192 kilometers. At approximately 7:50 in the morning tomorrow, the Soyuz will perform a circularization maneuver by which it will obtain a basically circular orbit around the Earth, which will facilitate the catching of the Soyuz by the Apollo spaceship.
One final other comment, the problem that they may have developed, as you may have heard on launch, that they lost some data that was not with the spacecraft, it was on the ground. There's no problem. The other question that came up from the post-flight news conference, Walter Caprian, launch director, concerned a possible hydrogen bubble in the RCS, or the steering rockets tank, and this apparently is not a problem. He says, as far as we know, it doesn't even exist, and the mission will continue. At this hour, now where the Apollo launch, 2 hours 4 minutes old, the Soyuz launch, 9 hours 34 minutes old, all continues to go well for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. I'm David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
ASTP, an exercise in detente.
It is now 5 o'clock and news time. We'll be right back.
For news from where it's being made, gathered by Network Radio's largest news staff, here is news around the world. This is Dan Streeter for American Information Radio. The 3 U.S. astronauts roared into space aboard their Apollo-Saturn combination from the Kennedy Space Center right on time this afternoon. Inside the Apollo, Thomas Stafford described the beginning of America's portion of the space rendezvous with 2 Soviet cosmonauts.
We have a liftoff, and the clock has started, and program 11. Roger, tower clear. I got a roll program. Yeah, she goes, pitch program, a little shaky liftoff, but it's smooth as silk now.
This is Vic Ratner at the Cape. After a near-perfect launching, the 3 Apollo crewmen got down to getting settled in to what will be their home for the next 9 days. The first major job, they've hooked up with and are checking out the 10-foot-long docking section, or flying airlock, which is vital to the Soyuz link-up. Over the next 2 days, Apollo will gradually catch up with Soyuz with short bursts of its rocket engine. Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov plan to shake hands in space for the first time Thursday afternoon. Vic Ratner, ABC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
I'll have more news in a moment.
Following the launch at the Cape, a launch control director, Walt Caprian, may have held his final post-flight news briefing. This is the end of the Apollo series. There will be no more such launches, at least scheduled at this time. This also means that some 1,500 men at the Cape are suddenly without jobs. What does this mean to Walter Caprian? Well, he's a little bit saddened.
Dedicated to the very last minute, and still is, was very excited as far as the aspect of having to relocate and in some cases lose jobs. The launch team feels very, very bad. And speaking as a private individual and not as a NASA official, I'm very sorry to see this happen to us because we're losing a team that I don't think we'll ever have together again.
Walter Caprian, a launch control director of the Cape since 1969. That's one thing that's not going to be occurring in the Soviet Union, Harry Walsh, because the Soviet space program is going to continue on with the Soyuz program, it appears.
I believe it will, and it will, of course, under their system, not have the same sort of start-up and stop that the American space program has seen. We don't know really the details of the number of people employed in the Soviet space program or exactly how it's done, but we have to assume that it will be continued at a fairly regular pace in the future.
Okay, once again at approximately 2:50 this afternoon, 1,500 men at the Cape are now without jobs. They were part of the launch control team. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
Testimony.
This is The World Tonight. Good evening. I'm Douglas Edwards, CBS News. The historic Soviet-American space odyssey got off to a beautiful start today. The Russians blasting off first from their space center in Central Asia, and then 7.5 hours later, the Americans blasting off from Cape Canaveral. It was history in the making, but somehow it came out almost routine.
5, 4, 3, 2, engine sequence start. 1, 0, launch commit. We have a liftoff. All engines building up thrust. Moving out. Clear.
Roger, power clear. Roger, Tom, you got good thrust on all engines. You're right on the money. Roger.
The weather turned out almost as good as the blast-off, and that was plenty good. Reed Collins has a report from the Cape.
381 milliseconds late, Apollo liftoff occurred. 8 engines drove the Saturn 1B into the blue sky and up through a thin cloud. It was clear enough at the Cape to see the first engine staging 40 miles up and 40 miles out. Rookie astronaut Vance Brand made a little mistake going up. He threw the wrong switch and activated a pressure system for a rocket control system. Those lines will have to be purged. The Apollo crew said very little on the way up, but instead got busy flying the spacecraft out, turning it around to extract the docking module from its storage space in the vehicle's stack. Coming over the stage for the first time, the mission commander Thomas Stafford reported the result of that maneuver to Houston.
Roger, got a good hard dock, looks real lined up, and all the latches are good.
If all continues to go well, the men will use that docking module as an airlock on Thursday through which to visit the spacecraft of the other side. This is Reed Collins, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center.
More news of the Soviet-American space journey after this. A good day for détente. First President Ford and Ambassador Dobrynin watching the Soviet blast-off together in Washington, and then words of congratulations from the Russians in outer space.
Soyuz, this is Moscow. We've just gotten the report that the Apollo launch was successful, has achieved orbit. We heartily congratulate Tom Stafford, Van Brand, and Deke Slayton. But the main event of the Soyuz Apollo flight is still ahead of us. Our space vehicles are still thousands of kilometers apart. We're in different orbits, and it must be one. For the best of everything to you, goodbye until tomorrow. Thank you, Soyuz. This is Moscow. Excellent.
The cosmonauts say they're feeling fine, but they do have some equipment to check out. Richard Roth has a report from Moscow.
Commander Alexei Leonov and flight engineer Valery Kubasov rocketed into space from the Baikonur Cosmodrome within milliseconds of the appointed time, into an orbit within a few miles of the one specified by the flight plan. The description used here has been nominal mission, everything normal. In the first few hours of flight, though, it seemed as if some kind of difficulty had developed with at least 2 of the small spacecraft's onboard television cameras, one in the cosmonaut's launch module and the other in the orbital compartment, the ship's main living area. Neither camera has so far beamed pictures back from space, and isolating the problem will be one of the crew's jobs tomorrow. That small problem seemed to be the only one facing the crew tonight, and after the launch of Apollo, Soviet Flight Director Alexei Yevseyev turned from his console at Mission Control and said, "This is the end of a successful day for both sides." Richard Roth, CBS News, Space Headquarters, Moscow.
More news when the World Tonight continues.
The launch at the Cape, a launch control director, Walt Caprian, may have held his final post-flight news briefing. This is the end of the Apollo series. There will be no more such launches, at least scheduled at this time. This also means that some 1,500 men at the Cape are suddenly without jobs. What does this mean to Walter Caprian? Well, he's a little bit saddened.
Was dedicated to the very last minute and still is, and was very excited. As far as the aspect of having to relocate and in some cases lose jobs, the launch team feels very, very bad. And speaking as a private individual and not as a NASA official, I'm very sorry to see this happen to us because we're losing a team that I don't think we'll ever have together again.
Walter champion, a launch control director at the Cape since 1969. That's one thing that's not going to be occurring in the Soviet Union, Harry Walsh, because the Soviet space program is going to continue on with the Soyuz program, it appears.
I believe it will, and it will, of course, under their system, not have the same sort of start up and stop that the American space program has seen. We don't know really the details of the number of people employed in the Soviet space program or exactly how it's done, but we have to assume that it will be continued at a fairly regular pace in the future.
Okay, once again at approximately 2:50 this afternoon, 1,500 men at the Cape are now without jobs. They were part of the launch control team. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
Houston received...
The hour on the hour from American Information Radio. This is Dan Streeter, and at this hour, the space race has turned into the space chase, with Apollo having begun its maneuvers to rendezvous with Soyuz. From Cape Canaveral, correspondent Vic Ratner reports.
In orbit, the only way to go higher is to go faster. And for the next 2 days, that's essentially what Apollo will be doing. Astronauts Stafford, Brand, and Slayton firing brief bursts of their rockets to close in on the higher-flying Soyuz. Slowly, carefully. If all goes according to plan, the two ships will latch together Thursday afternoon, beginning almost 2 days of Russians and Americans, working, eating, running scientific experiments together in orbit. Vic Ratner, ABC News, Cape Canaveral.
A new problem in the Middle East. That story coming up.
CBS News. Apollo has begun to maneuver toward link-up. I'm Jerry Landay reporting on the CBS radio network. In orbit now for over 11 hours, the Russian cosmonauts are asleep. In orbit for nearly 5 hours, the astronauts have started a series of sensitive maneuvers with the Apollo's service propulsion engine, orbital adjustments required for rendezvous with Soyuz on Thursday. The first burn took only a second, produced this reaction from astronaut Vance Brand, as relayed by Commander Tom Stafford to Mission Control in Houston.
His comments on experiencing his first service propulsion system burn was that it was like getting hit by a truck.
Brand, Stafford, and Slayton are riding in the more maneuverable of the two spacecrafts. More CBS News in a moment.
News of the hour on the hour from American Information Radio. This is George Caldwell, and at this hour, a minor problem on board the Apollo space capsule. Astronaut Vance Brand passed the word to ground controllers tonight from space orbit.
We've noticed last hour or two, it seems like the temperature's increasing a little bit in the cabin, and it's not too hot yet, but it is up on the gauge to about 77. Do you have any suggestions for cooling it down?
Roger, we'll look on that. We understand it's been increasing, and it's now about 77.
Ground controllers fed up some instructions, and as of a few minutes ago, the temperature was back down to 70 degrees. The Soviet cosmonauts have their own small problem, too. One of the 4 TV cameras on their ship is malfunctioning. The Russians have been given extensive instructions from the ground on how to fix it, something unusual in the Soviet space program. Cosmonauts seldom bother trying to correct non-essential equipment failures. Besides the heating and TV problems, the American and Soviet space missions have been letter perfect, from blastoff to Apollo's delicate maneuvers early tonight to put the special docking tunnel in position, the tunnel needed to link up with the Soviet Soyuz capsule. New Mideast dispute described as dangerous. That story coming up.
CBS News. 2 sets of spacemen from the United States and Russia are concluding their first day in orbit. This is Doug Poling reporting on the CBS radio network. 2 Soviet cosmonauts have bedded down for the night. 3 American astronauts enter their sleep period soon. All is reported well aboard their Apollo and Soyuz spaceships, launched today half a world apart. The only thing wrong so far is a minor problem. The TV camera aboard the Soyuz is not working. The Soviet spacemen have been trying to fix it. The big moment in this mission comes Thursday, when the 2 spaceships are to join together and the spacemen shake hands. As the U.S. and Russia were starting their joint space mission, exiled Soviet author Alexander Solzhenitsyn was speaking on Capitol Hill, denouncing détente. The Russian writer told lawmakers that future accords between the 2 countries will bury and pack down still breathing bodies in a common grave. More news in a moment.
Case
first change of shift briefing this evening, and that is with the first flight crew here at the Johnson Space Center that directed the launch operations and the initial phase of the Apollo mission. We have learned that perhaps we have two, if you could call them, problems throughout the entire day. The one problem with the Apollo craft, if indeed it is a problem, is a helium bubble in the RCS, or reactive control system, of the steering rockets with the Apollo command module. But as the flight directors have indicated, this is really not a problem. It's just a simple matter of bleed off or burn off. Outside of that, the Apollo command module is going extremely well. The crew is in good spirits. Everything looks extremely good at this time. The Soyuz spacecraft launched 7.5 hours before the Apollo. There was an indication that they did have a problem, and that problem amounted to the fact that they broke a television camera. And I believe Harry Walsh was following that a little closer.
Well, David, of the several cameras on board the Soyuz, one of them, the least important as it turned out, is malfunctioning. Otherwise, all the systems on the Soyuz aircraft, on the Soyuz capsule, seem to be working fine, and they are expected at approximately 7:46 a.m. tomorrow morning to do their final burn, which would put them in circular orbit, so that they would be in position to eventually link up with the Apollo spacecraft.
And the Apollo spacecraft at this time is in an elliptical orbit of about 128.2 by 93.9 nautical miles. Although it is steadily closing the gap with the Soyuz spacecraft, it is a game of chase now. Throughout tomorrow, the Apollo craft will continue its upward movement, and shortly before noon Thursday, if all continues to go well, they will dock with the Soyuz spacecraft. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
That leads the news tonight. I'm Charles Garrett, and this is the Late Night Report from KTRH.
Lee Fisher is next. News of the hour on the hour from American Information Radio. This is Dan Streeter, and at this hour, the 3 U.S. astronauts aboard the orbiting Apollo are still awake, although they were scheduled to go to sleep more than an hour ago. They fell behind schedule, working to correct some minor problems, including one that was causing their cabin to slightly overheat. The 2 Soviet cosmonauts aboard their orbiting Soyuz went to sleep earlier. So far, everything looks fine for the rendezvous and docking of the 2 spaceships on Thursday. Here's more on the space mission of détente from correspondent John Pollock at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Flight controllers here in Houston report excellent cooperation with their counterparts at the Soviet Mission Control Center in Moscow. Frank Littleton, Joint Flight Director here at the Johnson Space Center, says he talked with the Russian Joint Flight Director every 15 minutes or so throughout the day. Mostly serious business, but some of it frivolous. After the successful on-time Apollo launch, Littleton says he and his Soviet colleague joked about being able to throw out 5 thick books of contingency plans for use in case the Apollo launch was delayed. Flight controllers here also report close agreement between independent Russian and American calculations of the position of Soyuz in space. John Pollock, ABC News at the Johnson Space Center.
Almost forgotten among the excitement over the joint space mission is the independent Soviet flight of 2 other cosmonauts working at a Soyuz space station. Their work is not connected with the joint mission, but it does mean there are 4 Russians orbiting the Earth. The UN will take up Egypt's refusal. That story coming up.
Good morning. This is Dallas Townsend for the CBS World News Roundup. This is the second day of the joint United States-Soviet manned spaceflight, and so far all seems to be going well, with one exception reported from the Johnson Space Center by Nelson Benton.
The problem Apollo's astronauts start with today is a piece of hardware blocking entry to the tunnel, which is to connect their spacecraft to the Russian Soyuz. The tunnel, or docking module as it's called, was fitted on the ground with a probe device needed during the maneuver yesterday when Apollo moved the tunnel into place on the nose of the spacecraft. The next step was to remove the probe and check out the interior of the tunnel, but the probe is stuck. If not overcome, the stuck probe could prevent American astronauts from moving to the Russian spacecraft once the 2 link up tomorrow. But NASA's engineers say they can devise a method of removing the probe that it should take the crew about a half an hour to accomplish. The jammed
easy day ahead, making some course changes if necessary to catch up with the Russian Soyuz tomorrow. Nelson Benton, CBS News, Johnson Space Center.
And now the latest on the Soviet part of the joint space flight. Steve Young reports from Moscow.
Within the hour, the Soyuz spacecraft is scheduled to perform a short rocket burn of less than half a minute to make its orbital path around the Earth more circular. It's a routine and relatively easy maneuver. After that, cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov may occupy themselves in an attempt to activate a black and white TV camera aboard Soyuz that failed to function properly yesterday during liftoff. There are 3 other cameras aboard, so it does not have a critical role in the mission. Just after lunch, the Soviet spacemen will spend some time conducting scientific experiments. And toward the end of their day, the cosmonauts will orient wings which stick out from the sides of Soyuz so that solar cells which are attached can catch the greatest amount possible of sunlight. Unlike Apollo, Soyuz does not have fuel cells on board to generate power. After that, Leonov and Kubasov will check to see if their onboard television signals can be received by mission control in Houston. The Russian Flight Control Center at Kaliningrad will act as go-between. Steve Young, CBS News, Moscow.
Teamster Union technicians at a space agency tracking station near Fairbanks, Alaska, are threatening to strike tomorrow unless agreement is reached by tonight on a dispute over wages and working conditions. The man in charge of the station says it's not directly responsible for tracking the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft and could operate with supervisory personnel if the Teamsters walk out. But he says a strike might result in loss of some weather information that the astronauts would need for their splashdown. Railroad CBS News. Egypt and Israel are openly at odds this morning over the UN presence in the Sinai. This is Dallas Townsend reporting on the CBS Radio Network. For the most part, everything is still going well aboard the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft as they prepare for tomorrow's rendezvous. George Herman reports from CBS News Space Headquarters in New York.
Soyuz has now successfully corrected its orbit. The Russians haven't said so, but American tracking equipment says so. The American astronauts are struggling with the problem of a misplaced connector in the docking module hatchway. Just minutes ago, Houston radioed up new instructions based on a review of the routine photographs made of the area before it was closed up.
You're going to have to go ahead and get the probe jacket back out, though, to be able to access the area good. And there is one little nut down on the side of the pyro cover that has to be removed, and you can get at that with your ratchet W and socket number 1. And it doesn't look like much of a problem to get it off.
Next major action after all of this, an Apollo course correction this afternoon. George Herman, CBS News Space Headquarters, New York.
KBUC AM/FM, San Antonio.
News of the hour, on the hour, from American Information Radio. This is John Grimes, and at this hour, the Soyuz cosmonauts report they've successfully moved into a nearly perfect circle orbit of Earth now, about 139 miles up, ready for tomorrow's historic link-up with the Apollo trio. The Apollo crew is now busy trying to get a bulky docking probe out of the way, so once the 2 ships dock, the crews can move back and forth as planned. In Houston, we asked correspondent John Pollock what the job involves.
There's a little latch in the tunnel between the Apollo and the airlock module, which the astronauts have to release in order to be able to remove the probe from the tunnel. Right now, that latch is blocked. The astronauts can't reach it with the special tool they use to release the probe. Flight controllers here in Houston think they've found what's blocking it, and they say it's about half an hour's work to unscrew a little plate and remove the object that's blocking it, and then the probe should come out successfully.
Correspondent John Pollock in Houston. The government report.
You're next. 11 o'clock.
CBS News. No real problem.
problems on the great space mission, but a few worrisome moments which have now passed. I'm Richard C. Hartelet, reporting on the CBS Radio Network. The latest on Apollo-Soyuz from CBS News Space Headquarters and George Herman.
Problems troubling the astronauts involved the probe used to dock the spacecraft with the docking module yesterday. Docking was fine, but the astronauts couldn't remove the no longer needed probe so as to open the hatch into the docking module. Now, an electrical connector, which was in the way of the sort of crank handle needed to remove the docking probe, has been removed. The probe itself is finally out of the way. That leaves the tunnel clear for astronauts and, in time, cosmonauts to move from one spacecraft through the docking module or tube into the other. Here are excerpts of the talk from spacecraft to Houston as the connector and probe were removed.
You want to know where that connector is? Like, all we have to do is put the screw on to lock down this cap, and we're at Fat City. The probe is out. Hey, good, Tom. Thank you.
The appending connector, explained astronaut Brand, was in the way because its wire was too short, a minor construction goof. Aboard Soyuz, all goes well. The cosmonauts have been trying to repair that faulty black and white television camera, but so far without success. George Herman, CBS News Space Headquarters, New York.
New tension on the Middle East? That story in 1 minute.
It's been a relatively quiet day for the Apollo astronauts and the Soyuz cosmonauts. Astronaut Vance Brand, it took about 10 minutes this morning to remove a probe that was temporarily blocking the hatchway into the docking module. And contrary to some reports issued by other members of the media earlier in the day, this had never been considered a problem by anyone out here. It was a simple matter that the probe had already been used to extract the docking module and therefore was no longer needed, and it was a very simple process to remove it by simply taking out one little tiny screw and removing the probe. That has been solved, and as a matter of fact, the astronauts now have spent the last couple of hours checking out the docking module and doing some experiments. For this, they're having a little bit of trouble.
From all the gear that's around, huh? That's right, yeah. And when you put the UVA cable in, you can't do the fixed experiment because once you get behind that timeline, we're working it out, but things are just going slow because it's so damn crowded. Roger, understand.
And while the astronauts were being crowded, the Soviet cosmonauts were checking out their color TV. Harry?
Well, David, the irrepressible humor of Soyuz Commander Alexei Leonov occasionally flares up in what is usually a very serious mission. Just a few minutes ago, he was trying to provide a serious and informative discussion of the flight thus far to the Soviet people. But when he mentioned his flight engineer, Valery Kubasov, he began to fall apart.
And indicating what?
I believe it indicates that Flight Engineer Kubasov and Commander Leonov maybe have a few private jokes that we're not privy to on this.
They continue to have a problem with the one black and white camera which failed at launch. The spacecraft Soyuz were extremely good.
They were very good. The color was good, and you're right, David, it had nothing to do with the other camera, which is a fixed camera, an immovable camera, and a black and white one. And the pictures were quite good.
And again, everything continues to go well. Late this afternoon, the Apollo spacecraft will perform another burn maneuver, which will bring it into a little higher orbit and drawing closer and closer to the Soyuz spacecraft. Late tomorrow morning, they'll begin their final rendezvous. O'clock. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center. What appears if there are two zero-gravity zoos circling high above Earth. I'm David Crane with Harry Walsh with details on some rather interesting creatures in just a moment. The purpose of the Apollo-Soyuz test project is the testing of a compatible docking system for the two nations. Science has not been forgotten in this mission. And there are several mini experiments, and some involve some rather interesting creatures. Harry Walsh has a list.
David, I don't think Noah and his Ark had any more examples of animal life, fish, or assorted vermin than are on these two spacecraft. There are, for instance, some fish aboard the Apollo spacecraft where they will study the growth and development of a fish called a Danio rario under conditions of weightlessness. In addition, the Soyuz spacecraft has on board some zone-forming fungi, all Actinomyces levoris.
I know that one well. It's the MA-147 on board the Soyuz.
It is indeed, and it's designed to study the biological clock as it exists, or the so-called biological clock in life systems. In addition, David, you may not know this, but they have on board planned a microbial exchange.
You're not talking about the AR-002 or the MA-031, are you?
I may be, but it's designed to test the organism infection resistance, which sounds to me like it may also be designed to test the non-resistance to microbial infection. Apparently, the astronauts and cosmonauts intend to infect each other with whatever ails them, if anything ails them.
They're going to exchange germs.
I believe so.
Good heavens. But we must remember that this is still a very serious type experiment.
Yeah, serious indeed. If they get infected enough, we may not want them back.
Thank you, Harry. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
ASTP and exercise in detente. A special report from KTRH News.
At the tone, 1 o'clock.
CBS News. Soviet and American space crews have successfully worked out minor problems aboard their respective space vehicles. I'm Christopher Glenn on the CBS radio network. The cosmonauts succeeded in cranking up an onboard TV camera which had not worked since the launch from Baikonur yesterday, and they sent back the first color pictures from the Soviet Soyuz to Earth. The astronauts had little trouble freeing a docking probe which had gotten stuck inside the connecting tunnel, which will be used to link the two spacecraft during their historic rendezvous tomorrow. More from George Herman at CBS News Space Headquarters in New York.
The Soviet cosmonauts, starting out apparently with primitive tools, a scissors and knife, according to one account, got their camera working a few hours ago, producing this comment from Soviet ground control.
Alexei, I can see you. How can you see me? I can see you, Valery. You can't see me either. Which TV camera is turned up? I was right. It is Alexei. Can you see him now? Yes, I can.
The American astronauts, working with a fancier toolkit, had no trouble unfastening an electrical connector whose too short cord got in the way and removing the no longer needed docking probe. Their most serious problem so far, a bursting fruit juice bag which covered Tom Stafford in the inside of the spacecraft with psychedelic strawberry juice. George Herman, CBS News Space Headquarters, New York.
Earlier today, the Soviet spacemen successfully pushed the Soyuz into the proper orbit for the rendezvous tomorrow, and the Apollo crew will perform a similar course correction maneuver a bit later today. CBS News continues after this.
The time. CBS News. It's been a handyman special day aboard the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft as astronauts and cosmonauts make some repairs and prepare for tomorrow's historic meeting in space. I'm Stephanie Shelton reporting on the CBS radio network. On board Apollo, the astronauts pulled out a bulky probe from the docking chamber. It would have prevented the astronauts and cosmonauts meeting had it remained in place. The cosmonauts managed to fix their faulty color television cameras, at one point using Band-Aids, and beamed the first pictures of their craft's interior to Earth. Earlier, the Soyuz guidance jets were fired, nudging the ship into the proper orbit for tomorrow's link-up with Apollo. More news in a moment.
The minor problems aboard both the American and Russian space capsules have been solved. The astronauts today used a screwdriver to repair a bulky docking device aboard the Apollo,
while the Soviet cosmonauts fixed a television camera aboard the Soyuz and began sending television pictures back to Earth. In Houston, a NASA translator relayed part of the conversation between the Soyuz crew and the Soviet monitoring station during the repair operation.
They were giving us advice from the ground how about the TV camera, and we were repairing it. It's a good job. They told us from the ground, they told us that everything is going well. Well, now everything is normal. That's good. The main task is still ahead, and we have to get ready for it. How do you feel? Normally? Yes, thank you very much. Everything is normal.
The cosmonauts apparently used bandages from their medical kit to insulate a cable and get the camera working. Everything now set for tomorrow's Apollo-Soyuz rendezvous and docking in space.
4 p.m.
CBS News. The Agriculture Department announced a few minutes ago that the Soviet Union has bought 2 million metric tons of American wheat in what officials think may be only the first step of a larger grain deal. I'm Douglas Edwards, reporting on the CBS Radio Network.
Apollo astronauts Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand continue working with a series of experiments on board the command module this afternoon. About a half hour ago, they did take time out to fire up their steering rockets, a very short burst, changed the speed of the spacecraft only by 9 feet per second. It did put them in a slightly orbit, though. Again, this corrective measure designed for the eventual rendezvous and docking that will occur with the Soyuz spacecraft shortly before tomorrow. Meanwhile, I believe the cosmonauts aboard the Soyuz spacecraft are asleep at this hour, Harry.
David, or at least they're in the rest period at the present time. Both Soyuz Commander Alexei Leonov and Flight Engineer Vladimir Kubatov. Before going to sleep, or before entering the rest period at any rate, they managed, David, to exchange greetings and best wishes with Dr. and the two members of the Soyuz flight who are now aboard the Soyuz orbiting space station.
Once again, the Apollo astronauts continuing to work on a series of experiments. Earlier today, they were able to extract the probe, the mechanism used to pull out the docking module from the S-4B stage of the rocket yesterday. A very minor operation. It really presented no complications. A good short burn this afternoon in preparation for 3 longer burns of their rockets tomorrow morning that will place them in the proper rendezvous phase for the docking with the Soyuz spacecraft between 11 and 12 tomorrow. David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
O'clock at news time. We'll see you in a minute.
For news from where it's being made, gathered by Network Radio's largest news staff, here is news around the world. This is George Caldwell for American Information Radio. And American space capsules have been straightened out with the historic docking operation only 18 hours away. Here's a report from correspondent John Pollock at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Despite a few nagging little problems, the respective flights of Apollo and Soyuz are going quite smoothly. The Apollo astronauts ran into a little trouble removing a bulky piece of docking apparatus from the tunnel between Apollo and the airlock module. But with a little help from flight controllers here at the Johnson Space Center, they solved that problem and went to work on scientific experiments. The Soyuz cosmonauts, meanwhile, successfully corrected a problem with their color television cameras and also conducted scientific experiments. Both spaceships made small course changes in preparation for tomorrow's rendezvous. John Pollock, ABC News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
The House.
A word from the Russian public information commentator in Moscow. Let's go ahead and pick this up, Harry.
David, there is a lecture by the Soviet Public Affairs Office on the manner in which housekeeping and hygiene are carried out aboard the Soyuz. It's not terribly interesting, and if you've ever heard these things excruciatingly described by public announcements about the Apollo, then you've probably heard the one about the Soyuz. It basically tells about how they store the food, how they consume the food, how they get rid of refuse, and how they get water and general sanitation and hygiene within the spacecraft.
Well, I believe that's another first. I don't think we've ever heard that in detail from the Russians on how they took care of this problem.
I wouldn't think you'd want to.
I was back during the early days, though, of our manned space flight. That was one of the first questions always asked. How are these problems taken care of? And it sounds very similar to how we take care of the problems.
I hope so.
All right. Meanwhile, the Apollo astronauts continuing on with some of their experiments on board, preparing to go into their rest period as the Soviet cosmonauts have been in for the last couple of hours now. The astronauts Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, Vance Brand will be turning in the next few hours. Tomorrow is the big day, the docking day. They'll be up early, shortly after 4 o'clock. The docking to take place shortly after 11. The crew transfers starting early tomorrow afternoon if all goes well. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson.
Spacecraft for tomorrow is meeting with the Russian Soyuz after literally unblocking the way for themselves and the cosmonauts to meet face-to-face in space. Apollo's crew spent part of the morning removing from near the nose of their command ship a device which would have blocked their entry into the docking tunnel, which is to connect Apollo and Soyuz. The bulky docking probe was needed for Apollo to properly position the docking tunnel. Its removal was required for the astronauts to enter the tunnel from one spacecraft to the other. After fixing that, Apollo's crew checked out the docking module and its systems. Slayton is scheduled to sleep in the link-up tonight. With the same kind of success in the event of other contingencies and routine course adjustments as well, Apollo will join Soyuz on schedule tomorrow. Nelson Denton, CBS News, Johnson Space Center.
The Soviet cosmonauts asked permission today to use Band-Aids for some of their repair work, and if they did use them, they must have worked. Steve Young reports from Moscow.
Early this evening, Moscow time, the first pictures from the Soyuz spacecraft were received here since the launch of the Russian ship yesterday from the Cosmodrome at Baikonur. The Soviet TV system was supposed to show the cosmonauts right after launch, but something went wrong. Officials weren't sure what. Either one black and white camera, its amplifier, the cables, or perhaps the entire Soyuz system. At any rate, a color picture suddenly appeared, and Commander Alexei Leonov appeared positively elated. He said, "Dear friends, relatives, and TV viewers, this is our first broadcast from Soyuz." He then summarized the accomplishments of Soyuz so far. Leonov seemed fascinated with the effect of weightlessness and proceeded to twirl what looked like a flashlight so that it spun like a pinwheel. Leonov asked Soviet flight control at Kaliningrad, about 25 miles from here, if America knew the Russians had fixed the TV system. He was assured that they did, that even now, the Russian space pictures are reaching Houston. Steve Young, CBS News, Moscow.
The flight director's change of shift briefing is continuing here at the Johnson Space Center at this hour. It began some 45 minutes ago. Several interesting topics have been brought up, but first of all, Flight Director Pete Frank and the Joint Flight Director Frank Littleton, who's Joint Flight Director, that is to say he's in touch with the flight crew in the Moscow Center. All report, all is going well at this time. Everything is on schedule for the rendezvous and docking procedures late tomorrow morning. The probe-related problem was brought up several times in this discussion. There was a question as to what do you mean you used an old probe, a probe that actually was used on Apollo 14. It was quickly pointed out, as we've been attempting to do ever since we first broadcast about this at 4 o'clock this morning, that it was not a probe problem, it was related to the probe, and that the probe worked effectively late yesterday afternoon by extracting the docking module. Other things brought up were the fact that Deke Slayton called Vance Brand a strawberry because Vance Brand was having a little snack today, and it was strawberries, and he let some of it get away. And zero G's, it has a tendency to do funny things in space, and it began quickly spreading around the Apollo command module, hit a hatch window, and liquids and zero G's tend to spread evenly over such a surface, and Vance Brand did a cleanup job, but Deke Slayton said the window is clean, but Brand still looks like a strawberry. All appears to go well at this time. There was a question about the Soyuz, another their Soyuz spacecraft is ready for launch, and if that was expected to be launched, and there was an immediate denial to that, saying, no, there's no reason to. There was a question as to, well, didn't they say Soyuz 2 a while ago? And the reply was, yes, they did say Soyuz 2. They refer to the two cosmonauts, Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2, apparently taking care of that little procedure. We're seeing lots of new space faces out here at this time. I guess everybody from around the world is coming here for this one. Harry, any comments?
No, David. I cannot understand the continuing controversy over the probe. It seems like you and others have explained that the problem does not lie in the probe. I cannot understand the continuing controversy over a non-existent problem.
It's happened before, and I'm quite sure it will happen again. I guess one of the things is when they found out that it was a probe used on an earlier spacecraft, and the fact that it was related to that. Again, an explanation, it was with a pyrotechnic, an electrical pyrotechnic device that did not permit them to reach the probe. The probe has already done its job. So it was a simple matter that they used a little screwdriver, reached in, pushed aside the pyrotechnical device, and collapsed the probe. Pulled it out, and we're in the docking module. It was all done very, very quickly. Everything, again, appears all go for the rendezvous and docking procedures. The Soyuz crew has been asleep for the last several hours. The Apollo crew is wrapping up some experiments at this hour, although they will be given sleep time shortly after 8 o'clock Houston time this evening. They'll be up early in the morning. 4:10 preparations then begin with a series of 3 burns to put them into the rendezvous orbit with the Soyuz spacecraft. This is David Crane with Harry Walsh at the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News, a $300 million deal on wheat. I'm Jerry Landay reporting on the CBS radio network. Cosmonauts in Soyuz are now asleep, and American astronauts are now bedding down after a busy day of housekeeping and small repairs. Tomorrow is Link-Up Day. More news after this.
Cosmonauts made minor repairs aboard their space capsules today. Officials at the Space Center in Houston say everything's ready now for tomorrow's scheduled Apollo-Soyuz docking. This is...
It's now 10 o'clock.
News of the hour on the hour from American Information Radio. This is George Engel, and at this hour, astronauts and Soyuz cosmonauts have turned in for the night after a busy day in space. Both crews made repairs aboard their capsules, getting everything ready for tomorrow's scheduled docking. Apollo now behind and below Soyuz in orbit, gaining about 160 miles on the Soviet ship with each orbit. Secretary of State...